Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Vedic Astrology Podcast. My name is Fiona Marks, and I'm delighted to be here with you once again. I always look forward to having a chance to be with you on the Vedic Astrology Podcast, but especially today because I have with me esteemed Vedic astrologer Michael Reed, and he's agreed to sit down with the Vedic Astrology Podcast and share work, his life, and his insights into Vedic astrology. So, Michael, can I begin by just welcoming you and thanking you for taking the time to be with us here today?
Oh, most definitely, and thank you for having me on. I enjoy the way we're presenting this. Where in this modern day and age, where everything is YouTube, it's nice to have something that's more audio oriented. I'll share with you briefly before we get into things. When I was a teenager, right after high school, I worked at a radio station. And there was this elderly man who came on who had the morning shift right after I did. And he was just this perfect person at engaging with his audience. And he would always tell me, you just have to pretend like everybody's in the room with you. And so in listening to your voice, I appreciate the way you have started things off in that manner.
Thank you, Michael. And I agree with you. There's something about this audio experience transports me as well to my days as a teenager being on the phone to my friends after school. So let's be in the room together and begin our journey in this conversation by just asking, can you tell me something about your background and how you got into astrology?
Yeah, I always like to say, and you can see it in every astrologer's chart, it kind of hits a certain point where it's not necessarily that the astrologer finds astrology, but astrology finds the astrologer in some random way, shape, or form. And I found through engaging with my colleagues that everybody has, although somewhat different stories, very similar on a certain level, where things just kind of naturally fell into place for them. So, I always had an interest in astrology, and even more deeply so, like back in the early 90s. I think I went through a bit of an epiphany after a very difficult time in my life, and I started exploring all sorts of mystical concepts. I naturally kind of started gravitating before I was getting into astrology to things like the Rig Veda and studying Eastern philosophy. And then I started getting into more mystical concepts and exploring astrology. And shortly after that time, I actually lived with a professional astrologer, right? And so I started picking up a lot of what he was doing just by, osmosis, so to speak. And I had a background in radio at that point, and he decided he was going to have a radio show working with astrology and mystical concepts. And so I said, hey, I could run the board for you. So, I did that for a little bit. We kind of went our separate ways after all that happened. And I started doing things like pursuing teaching yoga, and used to teach Kundalini yoga for a while. And I went to see a spiritual teacher at a certain point. And there was an astrologer who always traveled with this spiritual teacher. And every time they were in town, if you were to try to get a reading with the astrologer, he was booked fully for the entire time, within a half hour. So it was really hard to get a slot with him. But I managed at one point to get a slot with him and sat down in the chair next to him. And he asked me a couple of questions about my dad, and then said, you were actually born a minute and 10 seconds earlier. And so for me, that just baffled me. I'm like, how does this person know that I was born a minute and 10 seconds earlier? Of course, now I know how they did that. They were asking me questions about my father, and they were aligning it with my D12 chart and figuring it out that way. But, for someone who's not knowing what's going on, it just seemed like this really amazing thing that this person was able to do. So I decided that in addition to teaching yoga, that I was going to begin to explore Vedic astrology for a little bit. And so I did, and I began to explore working with it and learning the fundamentals. And I re-encountered my astrologer friend in the midst of doing that. And he said to me, he goes, so you're studying Vedic astrology. He goes, well, even though you don't do the same type of astrology that I do, he goes, I've got a waiting list about 2 years long. Do you want to jump in? And so just kind of clicked together like that. And I went immediately into, doing readings and having a lot of clients because he had a lot of people on a waiting list. And it all just really started, kind of clicking in and going really well until it didn't. Which means the money stopped, flowing from doing that as a business. But I had been doing it long enough at that particular point, and and being a little bit later on in life, and having at that point now a huge gap in my employment, and having been self-employed, I went and tried to find jobs, and I couldn't find any work. It just became really difficult to find any work. So the only thing that I could keep doing was astrology, but astrology wasn't bringing in the money that I needed for it to bring in order to keep things moving along, until a random occurrence where I got invited onto another astrologer's channel a few years ago, Kapil Raja's channel. And it took my astrological career from, like barely eating to, doing really well. So I'm always really grateful for that period of time, because you generally find, or at least I have found, everybody that I've spoken to about astrology has been through some sort of an experience where it kind of put them through the mill, so to speak, right? And it tests you. It tests you to see, is this what you're really meant to do? Is this something that you're going to stay dedicated to? And that was my experience in terms of getting into doing astrology professionally. I got into doing it professionally, clicked really quickly, and then things didn't go well for a really long period of time. I was just barely, scraping by for years and years and years and years until things picked up. My experience with the nakshatras, which is what a lot of people tend to know me for, was really interesting, because when I first got into working with the Vedic system of astrology, and I first began to learn about the nakshatras, I was fascinated by them, but I didn't know why. And I found myself in a position, and I say this more from it being a mystical experience, because it was just really phenomenal to me that for some reason that I couldn't explain, I knew how to work with nakshatras, but I had had no training with nakshatras. And I've figured it out more recently that it's because I've got the moon on my ascendant. And so I generally find that anybody who has a really good solid moon, like especially in the 5th or the 9th, or interacting with self factors, or on the ascendant, quite often they end up really locking into the nakshatras, because it's more of an intuitive or subjective experience. So that in a nutshell is how I got into astrology, or how astrology found me.
What a ride, Michael. It's full of the ups and downs, the truth of the experience of life, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's interesting too. I'll touch on something that you are stirring up with that when you express that, is I think that having that difficult period, in my own life has really helped me with a lot of clients, because quite often you get people who come to you as a client and they're going through a really rough, difficult time. And to them, that is something that seems like it's never going to end, right? It's that feeling of, this is never going to end. It's always like this. And life is very transitional, and we think that difficult periods that we're in are never going to end. And then those positive moments come along and show us quite the opposite.
Absolutely. And I agree with you that I guess we tend to meet people at times of difficulty in general. That's when someone reaches out for a reading, and it is always helpful or comforting if the person that you're speaking to, you can share that, those realities of the ups and downs, and that life, as you say, is always transitioning.
Exactly.
It's equally interesting if you happen to meet someone in a very good phase of their life, and you can see that this is also transitioning, that this is a wonderful period, but, just like everything, it's transitory.
Exactly. But what I always tell people, when it's an up and down experience is, we see what we're going through as being the be all and end all, right? This is, we simultaneously think this is going on way too long and think that life is too short. And what we're experiencing is a drop in the bucket of consciousness. We see God as cruel, God's being mean to me. Oh, I'm such a good person because I was able to achieve this, when in reality, God's just wanting you to experience God because you're connected to that. We don't see that. We see this as being like, either some really horrible experience, or when things are going good, we want to give ourselves a congratulatory pat on the back. And sure, you need a strong ego to navigate life's experiences to a certain degree in order to kind of stay here in a physical body. But at the same time, it's good to recognize that you are not the doer. And when things are being really difficult in your life, you're not being punished for some cruel and, for some horrible thing that you did in the past. You're not being dosed out cruel and inhuman torture because you've been a bad person.
Absolutely. It's one of those really funny things, isn't it, that taking life less personally gives one more compassion for the self. It's a really strange thing, because you think that when one is the center of the drama, that's when one is the most caring about the main character. But there's actually something about realizing that you are a main character among billions of other main characters who are all that suddenly one can have compassion for one's situations, and this sort of love or brotherhood feeling towards the self becomes the main experience. That, let's ride out this karma together, me and my body, let's ride it out. And we're on a roller coaster, and let's see where it goes. We have no control, necessarily about some of these major things anyway. So let's just ride it out and see where it goes. And one becomes a friend with oneself in a way that one can't when you think that you're the driver and you think that you've caused all of this, and, I'm responsible, and it's too personal.
I'm thinking of this really wonderful picture that I saw once, which was of a particular spiritual teacher called Satchidananda. Are you familiar with Satchidananda?
Yeah.
There's a picture of him on a surfboard riding a wave. And really, that's kind of how it is, really.
Riding the wave. Tell me a little bit about, what do you see the role of astrology is?
I find that from what I'm going to tell you next, I have a lot of people who disagree with me. And I'm okay with that, because I think that they just aren't really connecting with what I'm trying to say. I think that astrology is one of the highest yogas that we have, if you take yoga in the true sense of the word, which is achieving union with the self and with the soul and with the infinite, so to speak. Astrology is one of the best tools that we have with that. Every time I say that to people, they want to go, no, astrology is a shastra, and I go, well, yeah, sure, technically, but it's a tool for yoga. It's a really wonderful tool for yoga. And I keep coming back, especially lately, because I'm working on this concept of connecting the function of astrology and the components of astrology and how they work with the 5 koshas within Vedic philosophy. And something that really kind of connects in on that particular tangent, especially in relation to the nakshatras, is the second sutra of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which I can't quote it exactly, but the English translation of it is about yoga being the cessation or stopping the modulations of the mind. It's about stopping the mind from being disturbed. And astrologers function on one level when they're with their client. What you're doing, astrologers, and I'm not saying this, to kind of pat myself on the back or, rub my knuckles or anything like this, but astrologers are pretty powerful people because we can stop time. That's our job, is to stop time and to take a look at a moment in time and tell the person about that particular moment in time. That's one of our jobs. We stop time so that the person who's kind of stuck in that cycle of time, space, repetition of their karma, we're kind of going, hey, step outside of this for a second and take a look back into it. Most of the time, people come to an astrologer because they have a special concern. When am I going to get married? I'm out of work. When am I going to get a job? And those are very, very important things to people. And I don't, kind of say no to prediction. I think prediction can be good, but I think that prediction has to be understood in the greater spectrum of astrology, which is the reason that the person is coming to an astrologer for a prediction is because something in their life is out of alignment, which is making them have a concern about being in relationships, or a concern about having a job, or a concern about, not having any money, which are very real things that are happening to that person. And so you want to address the concern. You want to address the concern about, about work. You want to address the concern about money. You want to address the concern about children or family or whatever the person's concerned about. But I like to, within all of my sessions, in addition to going into that prediction, kind of delve in beneath the surface a little bit and feed a little bit of information into the client to help them to understand, hey, maybe this is why you've got this going on. Maybe this is why this is happening. Because it's just like if we go to a medical practitioner of any type because we're not feeling ill, those things that are causing the unease in our body, like, perhaps, we're sneezing, or perhaps a part of our body, hurts, or maybe we're having problems with indigestion, or, any number of things. We go to see the medical practitioner to help us with that. And of course, we have to kind of alleviate the symptoms first, but always beneath that symptom is a root cause as to why the individual is having that specific problem in the first place. So I think the role of an astrologer is, yes, to give the client what they're needing and what they're wanting in the moment, but also to help them further, and to help them to get out of the repetitive cycles. I had one client, I remember once, that had been coming to me over and over again regarding relationships, right? They were wanting to know when they, might, get into a long-term committed relationship. And I could see in that person's chart that one of the main things that was a hindrance for them was they weren't comfortable with themselves. They hadn't become accustomed to, being okay with themselves. And so they were always looking for that relationship to feel that they were somehow a valid person, or a good human being, because they couldn't do that to an extent for themselves. So they would ask me if they were going to get into a long-term committed relationship. And I would go, well, sure, there's a potential right around this time, but it's not as strong as I would like to see to tell you verbatim you're going to have a relationship. And so it repetitively wouldn't happen. And they kept coming back to me like every 3 or 4 months when it wasn't working and asking me when they were going to have a relationship, until I finally had to say to them, I don't think this is helping you. I don't think that it's helping. And so we took a break from it for about a year until they, finally did come back, and they were in a much better place because they took a look at it. And so I think the role of the astrologer is to help the client in the best way that you can. And I think sometimes there's the risk that the astrologer runs of thinking that they know what's best for the client. And you don't. The client, on one level is going to be telling you what's best for them, right? So if they're coming to you for a prediction, you want to give them the prediction, but you always want to help them to see that there's something deeper that's going on in regards to why they're having that concern, and help them to understand that.
It's so fascinating, Michael. There's so many levels of this, aren't there? Because as you began speaking, I really feel that this ties back to what you're saying about astrology being a yoga or a tool for union, that fundamentally, when as conscious beings we feel connected to the flow of life, then we don't need astrology, because we're in the flow. And then it's when we approach an astrologer about marriage or work is because that stream of life flow called work, we're having doubts about because of evidence in the real world. We're feeling a lack of connection and a lack of trust. We're worried, about that flow.
Yeah.
And that in some ways the role of the astrologer is like this layer cake. There's like the prediction, which is a wonderful thing. And then there's also what you're saying, which is the underlying dynamics that are creating a lack of trust or connection in this area. But fundamentally, it's really a yoga question, isn't it? It's that I don't feel connected to life, It's just a question.
A colleague of ours, Ernst Wilhelm, once had something really wonderful to say about that, which, he was saying that people really only have one question, right? And it just takes a multitude of forms. And that question is, when am I going to be happy? So no matter if they're asking you about their job or whatever, they're asking you, when am I going to be happy?
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that. Another thing too that I find that while we're on the topic that's really helpful to discuss is, so you asked me about the role of the astrologer. I think or the role of astrology. I think it's also important in understanding the role of astrology to understand the responsibility of the client too. And this is a really interesting subject, because a lot of times people don't understand that the thing that's perhaps not the most helpful for them is for the astrologer to tell them what to do. Right? I encounter that occasionally, people who want the astrologer to say, you should do this or you should do that, when in reality, it's much more empowering if the astrologer just tells you, I see this. If we're talking about prediction, I see this happening, or I see this period of time coming. How do you want to approach it? I remember one particular example. Actually two, if you'll indulge me for a moment. So one was this man who was wanting to move in to a house with his son. And so he came and he was asking me about the timing of that. And he had a particular time in mind. And so I took a look at it and I said, I think if you move into that house at that point, you're going to be unhappy with the house. But in another few months, you would be happy with it. And he goes, oh, so I should wait to move into it? I said, no. Just take in mind that if you move into it immediately and you're not happy with it, that you might be happy with it soon. So the choice is up to you. It's not that you should or shouldn't. I also had another client once who was living with someone, their husband. They were living with their husband, and they were wanting a divorce to take place because basically they were living with them and were pretty much already divorced, but not technically so. So they were asking me when the divorce was going to happen, and I took a look at it, and I always like to share with people too, there's no perfect astrologer. People quite often expect astrologers to be perfect. We're going to give you a perfect prediction every single time. And a prediction will always eventually miss or be off, no matter how focused the astrologer is or how good of a job they're doing. So I was looking at this person's chart, and all the factors that would come together to create divorce were coming together. So I just told them, I said, yep, I think you're going to get divorce, and it's going to happen, around this time. I think that's when the divorce will happen. So that time came and went, and about 3-4 months after that, the person emailed me and said, I didn't get divorced. What happened? So I emailed them back and I said, did you try to get divorced? And they said, no. I said, well, that's what happened. Because we have to cooperate with life too. We have to kind of go with, if the energies are there to help you, you have to work with them. But if you decide instead that you want to stay in that dissatisfactory marriage, those energies will still play out. You'll be living in a committed relationship, which is the 9th house and, the 7th house things that are showing in the horoscope, and you'll be distant from your spouse, which is the other bit of it. You just chose to play it out in a different way.
Yeah.
I think that's important for people to know. It's like you play a role in that as well.
It's just fascinating because of what we spoke about, that we're not the doer and we are the doer.
Yes, exactly. Yes. But it's being done through you, though, you see, and that's the whole thing. And so, that brings up the always very interesting conversation, which is, if God is omnipresent, God, goddess, whatever it is you want to call it. I'm not giving it a gender when I use the word God. It's giving God a form like that is, on a certain level, in my opinion, creating a limitation around something which is limitless. So if God is omnipresent and within everything, then God is also within the individual. And so on a certain level, the free will of the individual and God's will are really one and the same.
Yeah. 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 There's so much to speak about there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's ask another question and see what comes up, and see if this joins with that or not.
Yeah.
Have you yourself consulted an astrologer, and what was the most useful information you've gained from an astrologer?
It's interesting. I had one consultation I was telling you about, where the astrologer was saying, oh, you were actually born 1 minute and 10 seconds earlier. I wasn't knowing how the session was going to go. I had no clue at that point, right? How the session was supposed to proceed. And I'll come back to that here in a moment. But aside from that, all of my other interactions with astrology, I have never had a professional reading other than that one professional reading. I'm not saying that everybody I've interacted with is not a professional, because they are, but I haven't paid for a reading. I've just had readings from my colleagues and from my friends, and professional advice from them, because on a certain level we all kind of watch out for each other on that level, and that's a good little brotherhood and sisterhood to belong to. The experience that I had with that initial astrologer, I wasn't sure what to expect, if I should be asking him questions or what the situation should be. But I remember him saying to me that some things that came out very earlier on in it is, he goes, "Oh, you have problems having children, but you'll likely meet somebody in a few years and you'll have a child." And that actually happened. It worked out that way within like a couple of years, and things did kind of turn out that way. That's what I remember most about that session. Everything else other than that has been me connecting with a friend or a colleague who's an astrologer. When I'm in that space where I'm going, yeah, I could look at this myself, but I really need to step outside of myself for a bit and have somebody else take a look at it for me.
Yeah, but it's beautiful, the things that we remember, isn't it? That this astrologer mentioned that arc of the partnership and the child, and that was the piece of information that was important and that stayed with you.
Exactly, and it did happen. It happened, in a very intense and difficult manner, because quite honestly, we went through, I think it was 4, or sharing very personal information here, but I feel comfortable doing that. Went through about 4 or 5 miscarriages before that happened. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and it's so interesting, isn't it, what the astrologer says?
Yes.
And this is a challenge as a young astrologer or a new astrologer, is how to phrase these things to a client.
Exactly.
Yeah, and in this case, the person, your recollection of that session was that they express that there may be difficulty, but we could see a passage through.
Yeah. And, that's something that when I teach astrology that I often tell my students, which is, tell the client exactly what you're seeing. Which is sometimes a very difficult thing. Astrology is quite often filled with contradictions.
Yes.
Right. So we have the Jaimini school of astrology, which is more concrete, showing this is what happens. That's what happens. You're going to get married. It'll come together really easily. The spouse is really strong and they're radiant. And then you go into the Parashara school of astrology, and it says, but you're very miserable about this marriage. In our mind, that's a contradiction. No, it's not a contradiction. They're both going on simultaneously, because the human consciousness is very complex. So when people are learning astrology and they see things like that, they'll go, well, which is it? Is it that the marriage is going to happen, or is it that the marriage isn't going to happen? Well, it's more than likely that the marriage is going to happen, but the person isn't happy with it.
Yeah.
So say what you see, even if it seems a contradiction, because usually you're saying something that's going to lock in for the client, so, him saying difficulty with it, that's usually the point that the client kind of steps in and says, what type of difficulty? And sometimes as astrologers, we can't always immediately see that. We just see the difficulty.
Yeah.
I think there was some television series, and there was some village seer, and people would always come to see him for like prophecies. And I remember one episode of it where somebody came to see him for a prophecy, and they started asking him, can you be more specific? Can you tell? And he goes, you want to know too much, and just gets angry with them,
Yeah.
Because it's like, you don't need to know all that. You just need to know. Yeah.
You just need to feel connected to the flow again.
Exactly.
In your current world, in what you think about with astrology, do you have at the moment a favorite sign, a favorite planet, a house, an aspect, a Varga, something? What are your current candies in the candy store?
I think the thing that I have been most interested in for quite a long period of time is it's kind of a putting together of several different things, which involves looking at the nodal axis, looking at how it's going to play out in the D60 chart and in the Rashi chart, working with things called the Shastiyamsha deities, looking at house cusps that come up with it, and using the nakshatras and putting it all together in a story. So I think I would say that the thing that I'm most interested in and fascinated in is the human story through astrology, that you can begin to see showing up. And it's always fascinating to me how you can be in a consultation and you're talking to a client and you're going into these things, and they'll say certain key words that connect to a nakshatra or connect to something that you're looking at in their chart right at that very moment before you even said something to them about it, right? And that's always a really powerful thing to me. So I would say that's kind of my favorite thing in astrology. I've also been playing around a lot lately with something called Sarvatabhadra chakra, which is a transit system involving nakshatras. It's a bit complex, would take a long time to kind of go into, but I've also been really enjoying playing around with that lately. I enjoy being the storyteller or the story listener, or sometimes a little bit of both. Yeah.
And so then what has changed most in the time that you've been involved with astrology? I take it, going back to the original story, that the friend that you radioed with astrology, he was a Western astrologer.
He actually was. But my first real, I would say, interaction with astrology myself was through the Vedic system of astrology. In other words, seriously engaging with it. But yeah, the person that I lived with was from that particular field.
And so if we look at that whole journey, what have been the significant things that have changed? Because astrology is a very alive field, it seems to me.
It is, and different things will come at different times. I would say back about 4 or 5 years ago, it was that nakshatras were becoming a really big thing, which I really enjoyed because that's kind of like the mainstay of my work. So I really enjoy and appreciate that. I think if I added into that something that has changed in astrology, which I would like to see kind of change in a different manner, is I would like to see people from any camp in astrology, whether the person's a Western astrologer, whether they're a sidereal Vedic astrologer, or whether they're a tropical Vedic astrologer. I'd like to see everybody getting into the space where they recognize, hey, you know what? We all have something to share with each other. Rather than thinking that I've got the corner on knowledge and, what I know is, because really with astrology, what we've got is a method of looking into the will of the infinite or looking into the will of God and understanding it. That's a pretty powerful thing. But to say that this way is the only way, or that way is the only way, or this is the right way to do that, or that way is the right way to do that, on a certain level, in my opinion, I think we're limiting it, because there's so many different ways that you can look at things and so many different ways to understand it. Sure, I gravitate towards one system because I find it to be the most accurate system for me to use for prediction. And I work with that. And I really strongly believe in that system to be super accurate. And if I'm going to teach people, I'm going to kind of recommend that system to it. But I also recognize that there are other systems, other philosophies. And if we get into a space where we're able to keep our positive discriminatory mind and kind of clear away from the prejudice mind, we'll find that we all have something really deep to learn from each other. So that's something I'd like to see astrology head back into, because I think it was in that space a few years ago. And I think it's kind of taken a trip away from that, right? And so sure, maybe that's necessary. Maybe people are kind of needing to go off and explore their own little things so they can re-engage. But I think that there's a lot to be tapped into on the collective level through astrology if we can get into the space where we all have something to learn from each other.
It's got that moving away and coming together energy that
exactly.
One has to deepen one's practice, maybe individually, and then from that place of security, one comes once again to the group and can be open to those other influences.
Exactly.
Good. Well, let's hope that the Vedic Astrology Podcast is part of that discussion and part of that environment, because also it's something that you would like to work towards as well, isn't it? Creating a community, creating a way for astrologers to exchange with each other, to communicate, to share.
Yeah, I think it's important. I really do, and pardon me, I also think that there's a lot of people, their main engagement with astrology is through watching YouTube videos.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they will go and they'll watch a video from one astrologer. And sure, there's techniques, commonplace things that every astrologer working with the Vedic system uses that are just commonplace, like exalted planets in difficult houses. Sure, those are common things, but people will quite often watch YouTube videos and they will hear one astrologer say something and they'll think that must be something that every astrologer works with. And so then they'll go to another astrologer with something about their chart that somebody said working with a different concept or with a different technique. And they'll go to another astrologer who will go, well, no, actually, I don't see things that way. And to the person who's learning astrology, that's just really, really confusing, because there's this thought that there has to be one way of approaching things. But we're all here on this, big planet spinning through space, hopefully having an amazing learning experience. And so we need to recognize and share, I think, with people that astrology is as diverse as, as humanity and the universe that we live in is.
Yes. I'm signed up for everything that you're saying, and at the same time, I know that people crave a discipline, right, or a kind of rigor to seeing an astrologer that they can have some kind of faith or proof that astrologer is a deep thinker or is a rigorous researcher. So yeah, and this is the continuum of intelligence, isn't it? That in some ways astrology is everything, is one end of that continuum, and at the other end is some disciplines around the investigation and the rigor with which one approaches the chart.
Yes, exactly. And I like to always share with people too, when you're learning astrology, pick one system and really stick with it. But, if you understand the nature of what we're working with, one of my students kind of posted something on my site recently, because I was teaching a class on the nakshatras, and I was trying to explain the concept of the difference between the sphere of the sky that's related to the nakshatras and the sphere of the sky that's related to the zodiac signs, and explaining them as being a different thing. And one of my students shared something really wonderful, which was a video of the sun hurling, through space, right? and all the planets rotating around that sun. It's just a thing that's constant movement.
Yep.
We don't know the origin of it. We don't know the resolution of it. To a certain extent, we can go and we can explore the origins of astrology, and we may find something, very, ancient, depending upon the culture. We can say, well, there are things like 6,000 years old, etc., but we don't know the origins of astrology. We don't. Yeah. And so that tells you something about astrology itself.
It's a very big, profound field, and our small human minds would like to put words on it or contain it or tell a story about it. And it's just so much more beautiful and bigger than that.
Yeah, there's something really interesting. I think it's from the Rig Veda. There's a quote about Varuna, who is mentioned. He's the one who created the nakshatras. And it says that Varuna placed the stars in the firmament and split heaven and earth asunder. So he created these nakshatras, or the stars, or things for the individual to learn from, and also created duality for the purpose of rectification of the karma, so the individual could have an experience of themselves. It's a really phenomenal thing. Yeah.
It is. It's a gift. So on that theme of the mind and what we can comprehend, and we've talked about that craving that is out there to have a discipline and to have a rigor to astrology, and that's important. And I think we've acknowledged that in what we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. So acknowledging that and not dismissing it in any way. How much, though, do you use intuition in your work and in your research and in your creativity of integrating different elements of astrology? What part does intuition play for you?
I think intuition on one level becomes inseparable from technique. But I think that it's important to have a little bit of both, because I think sometimes people will go into astrology just using astrology to stir up something in their mind. So they'll have a symbolic representation so that they, can intuit something, right? Whereas for instance, like we would do with tarot cards, which isn't me saying anything bad about tarot cards. It's just that you look at the symbol in order to stir something in your psyche, right? But I think that it's important to have technique and to understand things like confluence in astrology is something that really makes something happen. And the stronger a planet is in its productivity, the more the positive things related to, or the desirable things related to that planet will manifest. And the less welfaring a planet is, and the more it is in bad condition, the more the difficult things will manifest in relation to that confluence. That's technique. But when you learn technique after a while, it's somewhat like riding a bicycle, if you know what I mean. You just kind of know what you're doing. And so you'll look at a chart and you're naturally doing the technique because you know that it becomes second nature. I have one particular student who is at that point in their astrological journey where they're really good, they're very detail oriented, but they're getting to that point where they're so caught up in the details that they're getting lost.
Yeah.
And so, now I'm telling them that thing which is the opposite of what I've been telling them all along. So now I'm telling them the thing of it's time to throw the rule book out the window. Because you know the technique already and you're getting bogged down in your technique. And you're not allowing that technique to show you the answers because you're continually looking for the answer.
Yep.
Right? When the answer's right in front of you. Right? And that's something that's more of the intuitive side. You need the technique, but you also need the intuition. there's so many different reasons why. On an astrologer's job, you're continually looking at people's charts. If you're having a tired day, which inevitably you will, if you're exhausted, if you're going through emotional difficulty yourself, which eventually you will, it's hard to know if your intuition's going to work well, right? So you need the technique for that. You need the analytical side of it. And if you go too far into the analysis side of it, you'll just get bogged down in details, right? And so you have to have a little bit of a balance of both, but I think that that's something that just naturally happens when you've been engaging with astrology for a while. And it becomes this thing almost where you can't really say, I'm using my intuition now, or I'm using technique now, because when you've learned enough techniques, the technique and the intuition end up being kind of interconnected with one another.
Yeah, beautiful.
Just like every mother will know what their child is doing, even when the child doesn't want them to.
And then what's your favorite part of your job, Michael? And what has it been over time, and what is it evolving into? What do you love about your job?
I think I was touching on this a little bit earlier, and I will, so it gives me an opportunity to say it again, which is when I'm able to work with people, and I do engage with people quite often in my work over the course of several sessions, and I like engaging with people that way, where the first session will just kind of go into their story and understand the whys that are there. And when you've gone into things like a couple of times and you begin to recognize that the person's listening, and when you begin to see that that person's taking the information and they're applying it and they're changing their life and they're having better things happening in their life, it makes it so worthwhile. So when you can actually see the progress that somebody's making, right, then it becomes very easy to get into that spot of going, oh, I'm doing such a good job with my client, right? Which is that moment where something happens, because it's just that you're just being used to do something.
Yes.
So, you need to kind of let yourself enjoy that, because it's good. You're in a position where you're helping somebody, but you're simultaneously in a position where you're just the messenger. So I think I would say I enjoy being the messenger.
Yes, exactly. When one feels that one's in the flow of delivering that message and it's being received,
yeah,
it is a very enjoyable sensation.
Yeah, I had one experience like that once upon a time, several years ago, where this was during the things not going so well financially period, and I was working out of a healing arts center. And I actually had a good day where I had like 7 clients back to back. So by the time I got into the 3rd or the 4th session, for some reason, I was saying the chart without looking at the chart. And I don't know how I was doing that, right? But I was saying things and already talking to them about it and looking at the chart, and the information was there, if you follow what I'm saying. And so it was just, sometimes you do really get into the flow with it. And that's really, that's really helpful. Yeah.
Yes. And taking our discussion about the doer and the doing further, it can also be the case, when one looks at it that way, that those clients on that day, because of their astrology and their charts, were in an open moment to have a little input.
Yeah.
That unlocked something that was already there, that was ready. And it just happened to be the Tuesday when somebody said, whatever, fish and chips, they were going to, oh, I know what to do with that. Yes. And as the astrologer, you just happen to be, you catch them on that moment of openness where their timing was ripe.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I'm one of the few astrologers that I know at this point who actually still does person to person, like, over Zoom, rather than doing it pre-recorded. And I'll inevitably run into these things where something will happen and I'll have to reschedule somebody, right? Like something will happen with the computer, or this will happen. And upon occasion, it's happened where I've rescheduled somebody once and I've had to reschedule them again because things just keep coming up around their chart. And, it ends up being a situation where, I'm going, well, I'm wanting to connect with this person, but maybe something will happen, like they can't get Zoom working, or, or any number of things like that. And then finally, when we connect, the consultation goes really well. And you can look at their chart and you see, this is why you had to wait until this day to have this consultation, because any other day it wouldn't have worked for you. So it's all about, divine timing in that particular. Yeah.
It is. Exactly. Yes. Yes. Yeah, totally. We're kind of doing absolutely nothing. The client's doing nothing and we're doing nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's wonderful. All right. And to wrap up our conversation today, is there anything that you would like to say about the future, what you're excited about regarding astrology, where you see it going, or what you're involved with? Anything you want to say that is, tantalizing your vision for the future about astrology?
I'm really enjoying my my online academy. I really enjoy teaching, so I'm getting excited about teaching more and setting things up more with that, and creating a place where people can interact about astrology in addition to learning astrology. I always enjoy my one-to-one work that I do with my clients as well, and enjoying getting more and more as the years go on into connecting with people over multiple sessions. But in addition to that, something that I'm really working on is, quite often if you go to somebody, even somebody who's been doing astrology for a while, and you say to them, how does astrology work? You usually end up with the person going, I don't know. Now, it's interesting because I noticed I think it was on your podcast or something that you were doing. Was it you and Ryan that did something on how astrology works? And that's a topic that I've, really been working on a lot lately. And I've been kind of connecting to it through understanding the 5 subtle sheets of Vedic philosophy, and how you have the planets and the nakshatras that are operating more upon the more subtle layers of those sheets. And you have the rashis and the houses that are interacting more on the grosser level of those sheets.
I love that conversation, Michael. I think this is something that I'd love to spend more time speaking with you about, because I find this really powerful, the joining of yoga philosophy more directly with astrology. And I think it might be a video that I did with Sachin Sharma, and we took the Vedic model of manifestation, and we were just talking about at which levels where do planets get into this, and where do elements come in, and for me it adds so much richness to looking at a chart, and to the experience of being in this energetic human body. So I'd love to speak more about that. I hope that we could get together and maybe do an episode on that, or do something on that in the future.
Sure, most definitely. But it's interesting because it's right in Brihat Parashara Horus Shastra. So it's like people always go, I don't know how Vedic astrology works. It just does. And then I keep wanting to say to them, look at Brihat Parashara Horus Shastra. It explains how astrology works. There's a model that's explained there within it, really. And that's what's really fascinating, is there's, an actual explanation that's there that helps you to understand. It's in somewhat, coded language, but it's definitely there.
Great. Okay, we have our next podcast episode already penciled.
There we go.
Wonderful. Michael, thank you so much
Sure.
for your
My pleasure.
time today
Yeah.
and for sharing your rich experience of Vedic astrology. I've really enjoyed hearing how your journey's evolved and this power that you have of integrating different elements and bringing them together. And as I'm hoping to talk about in the next time we get together, integrating the 5 koshas and Vedic astrology. Thanks so much for your time.
Excellent. And thanks for having me on the channel.
You're welcome.